So this is a big one. For many, it's been building for almost 30 years, and for others around 4 years. Either way, the impact of this game is most likely to be spoken about for maybe just as long, or at least for the next 3 years until we get the final installment, Final Fantasy, or whatever they're gonna call it. In short, you could say stakes were high for this game. So I'm here to talk about, does it deliver? Well, here's my thoughts. So some hygiene before I dive into anything. I want to be aware I'll be staying away from mainline story spoilers, which is on a whole nother novella in its own fucking right with this game, but will however be some minor playthrough spoilers, and obviously spoilers about Remake and some OG spoilers. And FYI, if you haven't played the original, like please do so. Like now. Right now. Cool. So I'm going to assume you've just gone out and played FF7 OG and Remake. Now let's talk about it. I owe a lot to the original Final Fantasy VII. It's the first game I played that caught me emotionally and had me totally immersed in anything like that in my young life. It's responsible for my closest and best friendship still to this day by bonding us through a mutual love of the game and the overall experience. I was young enough to not fully understand some of the deeper and darker themes present in the game, but also old enough to recognize I was experiencing something special that was not offered anywhere else. If you were somewhere between 9 and 20 years of age, I guess, maybe even slightly older, this was basically a coming of age game for you at the time. And I could honestly say I owe calling myself a quote unquote gamer to this game. Without this, I might have just been playing the arcade platformers, races, and the shooters, to which no doubt I probably would have eventually burnt out on gaming. But thankfully, after FF7, my appetite was quelled again with their follow-up in my favorite, Final Fantasy VIII, but that's for another time. So let's fast forward 22 years later, and Final Fantasy Remake did the same thing for me. I actually didn't play it immediately and was skeptical of if it could deliver on the level that some of the greats around the time have. I'm talking The Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption 2, God of War, but that early friendship I mentioned previously convinced me this is something I need to experience. And bang, just like that, I'm back in and obsessed. Quickly, too, might I add. So Remake was a very flawed game in my opinion. For many reasons, and as frustrating as some of those flaws were, I could overlook all of them. Whether that was due to nostalgia or not, I don't quite know, but Remake, like its predecessor, managed to bring some new magic into the modern gaming world for me, whilst almost giving itself unprecedented levels of hype for its sequel in Rebirth. All that is to say, Square Enix, myself, and indeed many others, this game needed to fucking deliver. And whoa boy, did it ever. So let's start with the good. Picking up straight after the events of Remake, many speculated how this game would play. Would we get another rendition of the Midgar linear style hallways into little hubs, or more of a FF16 open world style of like Valistia? Thankfully, we got neither. Honoring the freedom and the wonder of the original game, we get a full open world, and when I say world, I mean world in capitals. Full free travel everywhere as you unlock each region with only minimal story locks occurring that keep you in certain regions at times. The open world in this game is beautiful. I found myself slow walking a lot of areas and taking in distant surroundings non-stop. Load times are almost non-existent, with the only cost coming at some further scenery in the background that is really hardly noticeable unless you're looking at a key feature. Let's say Midgar or the Junon Cannon and the Golden Saucer. They all have a certain Christmas to them at no matter what times and what distance you view them from. After spending roughly 100 hours, mainly in the open world, puttering around with the many quests, I'll get into those more in a bit, brings me genuine joy to say this is one of the best and most thought out open worlds I've played. It's not immune to the old Ubisoft open world trope, but in no way is this done half-heartedly. This feels like an inspiration and a mix of games that have come before it. It was always going to be a tall order to recreate that feeling you first have when you hit the open world in the OG FF7. Mostly because we hadn't seen anything like that in the era of gaming on the PlayStation 1. Although we are spoiled in what games can produce these days, it would still be touch and go to recreate just how open that world was at the time and not have it feel lifeless right now. Everything here feels strategically placed, so you're not that far from a point of interest, but have just enough space in between the next one to feel like you're exploring and have enough freedom to discover something interesting. In total, there are 6 regions, with varying sizes, looks, and feels to them. They have adapted these iconic locations better than anyone could have imagined, and even reimagined some. Calm and Junon being such standouts for me personally, it really gives a uniqueness to the town that maybe wasn't that present in OG. Don't get me wrong, each region replicates a lot of tasks, as I said previously. The usual tropes are here: activate a scan tower, find your fast travel spots, in this case tame the local chocobo, and of course help the locals and fight the region's enemy amongst other fetch quest objectives. It can be a bit same after the 4th region, but these feelings that you start to prop up is very much offset by region-specific objectives and side quests and the minigames. An often forgotten part of FF7 OG is the amount of minigames it had, and Rebirth does not disappoint in this area. As a matter of fact, it's comprised probably of 80% of the game. There are not just throw-ins either. Real thought has gone into these minigames in both their frequency and their variation to keep you engaged and moving. You'll find some, in my opinion, quite easy, and others so frustrating you'll squeeze and twist your controller so hard it starts to splinter. And that's not to mention the fantastic world card game that they've brought in called Queen's Blood. The depth and strategy is so layered and rewarding, it doesn't surprise me that fans are asking for this to be a standalone mobile game of sorts. Final Fantasies tend to excel when they introduce such a memorable element. Blitzball, my favorite triple triad come to mind, and now Queen's Blood will join as the ranks of them. Despite how good all of this is, it's not what makes the world experience great. Continuing on, for one of Remake's standouts is the exposition and depth of the world, and most importantly its characters. There are a lot of political grey areas here. Yes, we know Shinra are the bad guys, but there are parts where they're displayed in a more humane way, and you're reminded that this isn't just good v bad. It's a very nice touch for a modern adaptation, and exactly what the devs meant when they said they will be updating aspects of the story here. We knew we were in for some emotional beats to certain parts of the story with Barrett, Red 13, especially after Remake's changes. We could never be so sure as to what would happen. But thankfully, each party member here gets their time to shine. With how much Remake focused on the core 4, which I would attribute to Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, and obviously Aerith, it was great to see they don't have more or less focus than newcomers to the party. Red and Yuff both bring much needed new energy and dynamic to the party. And how the story is told, you truly feel invested in all members of your party. There was never a moment that stood out of place or where I thought I haven't heard from this character in a while. They all pitch in, and I must say, it just feels very authentic. Characters don't address each other constantly, and they all feel a part of an organic conversation. The writers could have just mailed in some original dialogue and called it a day, but they obviously didn't here, and the thought shows. Kudos to them for innovating and fleshing out story beats whilst balancing some serious tone and emotion, with the occasional lighthearted humorous moments. They don't feel out of place either. It all works perfectly. In fact, I wish I had more of what I was just talking about. More casual conversations whilst traversing the world. I'm not to say that it's not here, it was just so fun to listen in, and I just wanted to hear more of it. Bringing all this to life, I must say every voice actor deserves their praise. The delivery of their lines in every area is second to none. I'd be lying if I said I didn't shed tears in parts, especially when it came to Red 13's questline. If you know about Seto, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. This hits that beat. Aside from the general storyline and party interaction, each character gets their due, all leading various sections of the game, or traditionally, a dungeon if you will. Some I found quite enjoyable. Yuffie's grappling-led adventure and Red's cave diving adventure were clear standouts, but sadly, not all of them land. I'm really looking at you here, Kate Sith, and particularly the last chapter's version of this. I don't want to spoil who it is, but if you played it, you know what I'm referring to. It feels a bit long, and I think these are more likely to be universally acknowledged as the lesser enjoyable side than anything else. However, these generally don't impact, I guess, the overall experience of the game. Now, the single best aspect of this game for both newcomers to the series and the OGs, and that's the battle system. Most AAA titles you expect a lot from. Presentation, gameplay, story, writing, and usually all the time great titles can hang their hat on one or more of those core elements. You'd be forgiven in thinking it's the size and scope of Rebirth with its minigames and world design, but for me, it's clearly their battle system here. Quite frankly, it's fucking outstanding. I'm not exaggerating when I say this should be the standard for all future Final Fantasies. I can't even begin to imagine how good Final Fantasy XVI's game would overall improve with this battle system in place. That's for another story though. With how Remake introduced us to the new battle system and hinted with the Integrate DLC we would be getting some changes, many speculated what we would get and very few doubted it. You could just put Remake system here and it would still play awfully well. But no, gone are the frequent silly interruptions and cancellations of spells and moves along with your robbed ATV that made you feel cheated. It's hard to find flaws in the original conception, but they were there, but also it was equally as difficult to find improvements, but somehow the team have managed to do both. It just feels smoother and more playable in every way. Every action you take here, your thoughts, your strategies, are rewarded and it feels deserved. Yes, you can button mash your way through some fights, but even on normal mode, I was punished for underestimating my opposition. And well and truly after my first playthrough, I'm only starting to see the depth that is offered here. I'm talking adding elemental attacks that don't use MP and even their parry mechanic. Playing on hard and the challenges offered after completion is no walk in the park, but is where this battle system really shines. Now Remake had some post-game hard challenge battles. I personally found them the most annoying part of Remake when I was going for the platinum. They all felt lucky, not earned, like a difficult Souls boss where so far here in Rebirth, although still incredibly difficult and some would say even more so than Remake, it's actually more fun. I don't feel like this is luck and I'm just repeating and hoping for the best. Every challenge I complete feels very true and earned, so full respect. I'm actually just in awe of how complex a setup you can have. New materia, weapons and abilities along with each party member's uniqueness allows for countless ways to take down your foes. We've got a new skill tree here as well, which will allow you to open up all your members. You won't be forced to use certain members here. There are no weak characters. I've significantly enjoyed Aerith much more this time around due to changes she has received. I haven't even mentioned the new synergy options yet, where we have 2 party members team up to unleash a cinematic attack, usually dealing a great deal of damage. These provide even more depth and strategy to not only how you fight, but even to your upgrade skill tree choices. Now, there's a lot of talk around turn-based combat or real-time action recently, especially after FF16's action-oriented take, and Baldur's Gate 3 of course. But truth is, we probably have the best of both here. I couldn't think of anything more fitting for a modern remake interpretation of Final Fantasy. I know the next title in the series is going to bring the system to another level for what we should encounter in the story, and truthfully, I hope FF17 doesn't get cute like 16 did and just adopts this combat system. Square has really made something special here. It's like we are witnessing the birth of its own genre, much like we've seen so long ago with the coveted Souls-like. Okay, now the dreaded what's bad. There's not much wrong or many opportunities with Rebirth. It's a testament to how great the game is. However, I feel for the little amount of opportunities this game has, they are pretty severe in my opinion when they do arise. So let's get into it. Although it's against every fiber of my being, I must talk down on FF7 Rebirth. Chadley. Fucking Chadley, dude. I hope he didn't annoy you in Remake because, and not joking when I say this, he has the most dialogue of any character in the game and gets more screen time than he way deserves. In concept, he's good for the game, essentially directing you through each region, giving you insights and reasons to explore regions with his world intel checklist, but it all feels very flat and a checklist. As by the third region of Corel or Costa del Sol, it very much feels like all these tasks are really for him and not for you. The reason is, I felt it took a big chunk of the adventure out for me. I would have loved to have seen a lot of Chadley's world intels taken from him and put into locals of each region. Towers, proto-relics, and dig sites, basically some enemy intel. Yeah, that feels more natural for Chadley to have. But the life springs, summon crystals, these could have been left to your own exploration. Maybe the life stream springs could have been worked into commentary with Aerith, as opposed to constantly looking down at your robotic gun 20 times a playthrough. These tasks should come with no icon on the map either, just rewarded by pure exploration, and curiosity and clues and hints from talking with locals. I didn't realize it when I was initially playing through, as I was just in awe of the world, but we really don't have any incentives to explore. and are not rewarded at all when we do so. Unlike OG, you won't find any super rare materia hiding in a cave, or a new weapon, or an exotic enemy, or any missables for that matter. It's all done through Chadley and local storefronts. It's just a bit of a bummer. Just like the materia he synthesizes, it just feels fake and forced. Hiding summons behind his VR battles is blasphemous to me. Final Fantasy has been long known for its epic summons. Each iteration has presented them in different manners, but they all have a grandeur to them. As I like to say, Ifrit is not just a summon, but it's a lifestyle. For how bad Final Fantasy XVI was to me, even its biggest naysayers I think would agree that moments like this had us gasping for more.
The truth of it now. You are not afraid. I am.
And truthfully, nothing comes close in Rebirth here with summons or beasts. I could forgive it in Remake considering we were in Midgar, and incorporating these summon moments was difficult given the environment, but we really were robbed of something in this open world by meeting them all through Chadley. The way Remake and Rebirth has handled some of the spectacle story moments has been great. I'd love to see that in meeting a summon in the wild. There's plenty of space and areas in this world where this could be achieved, instead of just constantly looking in the blue VR arena. I hope this is fixed in the third installment. Along similar lines is another underwhelming part I found, were some of the boss battles. Hard for me to say, but I'm right. There's some very cool and unique bosses and mini boss battles in FF7 OG, and even in Remake. Remake also had this sense of build-up and over-the-top craziness to their boss encounters that I feel Rebirth missed out a bit. Whether it's because they are reused enemies from Remake or they came across as very generic, I'm not too sure. As an OG player, I had little storyline markers in my head, and I was looking forward to encountering certain enemies. But once the encounter was there, I just found myself more than not being a little bit disappointed. There is no definitive Hell House here, or even a Reno or an Airbuster for that matter. There is the occasional enjoyable encounter and one at the end of a specific quest which I won't spoil, but that one aside, the boss spectacle overall is ultimately a letdown. A little objection to add on to this though, is the difficulty calibration in areas. I played through on normal mode, and on one or very small occasion got lazy and died, but however, I ran through most of the enemies and bosses at first try with ease. I do wonder if this takes apart to what I just said. It's no secret FF16 suffered from this, and Rebirth is nowhere near that, but if you do the side quests like you're instructed or focus on some leveling and the new materia, there's not much in the way that can stop you. This is even reflected in the minigames you encounter. Some seem like a slog, as they're quite easy, but you just have to get through them. But when the frustration really kicks in is when this is at the opposite end. As I said, there was a small occasion where you tested both because the enemy seems impossible or the minigame is out of this world frustratingly hard. It's a difficult balance to strike where a player is tested consistently and not discouraged. With Remake, I was constantly tested and I felt like when I died it was mostly in a fair manner, but also I didn't feel like I needed to return and sweat it out. I could just apply what I learnt and execute. In Rebirth, when this happens, you feel like you just dropped into a FromSoft game. There's a couple of villains or enemies or battles, minigames that come to mind, but I'll let you find out for themselves. So for a seasoned player new to the game, I would suggest a dynamic mode. And now lastly, a weird one. The pacing of the game, to me, is just a little off. Just to be clear, I approached my first playthrough with a completionist mentality. I was so smitten of being in this world again, I wanted to do every quest and complete every region before moving on. Now on my hard playthrough, I will be purely mainline story progression to confirm this, but I still think there's some issues here. Regardless if you do the optional side quests or not, there are significant periods of time between massive story beats, in which Remake, I would say roughly 85% of what you do progresses the story forward and adds an element of haste to it. By the end of Remake, you are the enemy of the state, on the run from Shinra and coming to terms with a much bigger problem in Sephiroth. This was also complemented with flawless character exposition along the way. It just felt jam-packed of story and revelations that by Remake's final chapter, it was leaving us with the best questions and intrigue. In Rebirth, that all comes to a really slow halt, almost immediately after the initial intro, which is strange considering Remake and introduced the Zackverse at its end. In a regular playthrough, my guess is you go anywhere between 15 to 30 hours without encountering any of those story beats about Zack or his verse. A lot of the beats are offset with the minigames and side quests too. Even as an OG player, it felt a little off as some of it can get pretty zany at times and really change the tone. You go from a super sombering boss encounter where all the party reflects on the loss incurred to just segueing and playing Rocket League Pet Ball with Red 13. We all remember the Kate Sith WTF moment from Remake and how newcomers to the franchise reacted. I wonder how this game will feel for them. That's not to say you don't get a lot of story here, but it all just comes at the end. The last chapter, you're just bombarded with so much information and story that you can handle in the one act. Could argue that pretty easily, I think, on reflection. By the credits, you feel like this would have better to be sprinkled throughout the whole journey rather than just the last chapters. My guess is the next part 3, will feel more like Remake in terms of story pacing and wrapping everything up, as we are left with some massive questions here we thought we'd get answers for in this game. I generally feel bad for some of the critiques I've put forward here, but I would be lying if I said I didn't feel them when I was playing or I was being picky. They were there, and they're an issue. Luckily, despite that, it really has no bearing on how fantastic this game is. If they fix those, it would only take a fantastic game to near god tier levels of perfection. You have to be careful with Final Fantasy these days. Any slight praise or criticism can be met with severe vitriol online. At times, is way too politicized to me. It's all bullshit. There's no such thing as a true Final Fantasy fan. And if it's not obvious, you can absolutely compare two games that came out within a year of each other, on the same system, by the same publisher, under the same umbrella name, despite what the weirdos say. I'm referring to Final Fantasy 16 there if you didn't know. The backlash to Remake's changes and the so-called betrayal experience shows just how silly these fans are. The reason I'm mentioning them is this is all noise, and it's louder than ever given the time we live in and the technology we have. It's a long way from 1997, where I was reading a printed out Word document from a friend's older brother on where to find certain material and how to beat the ultimate weapons. It was a time I'll cherish for life, and with Rebirth, I would have been lucky enough to have the same feeling again. Having experienced both the PS1 classic FF7, then the remaster, and now Remake series has truly been a blessing for myself, and ultimately I reckon my generation as well. If you remove the sentimental aspect, then what you're left with is a game that by today's standards is such a standout, it really is unbelievable. I took a week off work when this released to play it, and in honesty, I should have taken months off. I didn't play anything else since starting this, and I didn't feel the need to. Rebirth, it just consumed me. In an age where pay-to-play games are actually a thing, and AAA games are being released broken, and in need of patching, we have this masterpiece on time that has no right to play this world. The open world, music, presentation, voice acting, writing, it's all done with such a level of care and effort that really just shines through. I'm thankful to the whole team that put this out there and that I got to experience it. If by chance you're watching this and you have not played Rebirth or Remake yet, or even the OG, I can't stress how much you should start from OG, then go through and play Remake and now this. And I truly envy you being able to discover it all for a first time. Part 3 seems like an eternity away now, but if it's anything to the level of what we get in Rebirth, I'm sure it'll be worth the wait.